Great. Now that we've heard updates from sponsors that are actively planning clinical trials or engaged in clinical trials right now, we want to turn to our final panel discussion of the day for around clinical trials with a focus on moving forward. How do we do things better? How do we build off of everything we've heard today from the patient perspective, the regulatory perspective, the lessons learned from trials conducted to date to try and conduct clinical trials for mitochondrial disease in a way that's going to give us a better chance of success. So we're really fortunate to have first our esteemed moderator, Dr. Amel with us again, and three representatives from industry, Niall O'Donnell from Reneo Pharmaceuticals, Magnus Hansson from Abliva, and Tolga from Astellas. These gentlemen have agreed to talk about their plans around primary mitochondrial myopathies and myopathy-related indications within mitochondrial disease and see where the similarities are, how we've assimilated some of these learnings and how we can apply them going forward. So Amel, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit of Q&A here.
Yes, so do we want them to introduce themselves a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to start, each person.
Yeah, so Niall, why don't you start?
Sure. Hello, everyone. This is Niall O'Donnell, CEO of Reneo Pharmaceuticals, which is headquartered in San Diego, also with operations in Europe and the United Kingdom. Reneo has been in existence for 2 years, moving through some clinical trials in primary mitochondrial myopathy and other genetic myopathies. And my background is I cut my teeth in drug discovery and development at Johnson & Johnson, and had a real passion for orphan genetic diseases over the last few years, being involved in a couple of near soon to be approved programs in pediatric liver disease.
Thank you. And Niall, can you tell us a little bit about how Reneo has thought about implementing a new clinical trial in primary mitochondrial disease when you have, after you've seen the experience from other clinical trial companies that have either been unsuccessful so far or are still trying to figure out how to implement trials in this very heterogeneous population of patients?
Sure. Well, the first thing was to assemble a team of experienced orphan disease drug developers. And I think you folks will have heard from Alejandro Dornenbaum, our Chief Medical Officer, who in a past life got Kuvan approved for a rare genetic disease whilst at BioMarin. And bringing that creativity of thinking on how one develops a drug was critically important to thinking about the disease, especially a disease in which unfortunately no drugs have been approved. And also in Alex's past life, he was involved in a program for a rare disease called MPS 6, where an innovative walk test, the 12-minute walk test, was used to approve that product. And so bringing that thinking, talking to folks like yourself, Amel, and all the KOLs, and actually attending the UMDF and interacting with the Lilly Foundation in the UK, we came up with the concept that we would really like to focus on the energy, endurance, and fatigue components and of the disease. That's what we were hearing from, especially from the adult patients, that was most deleterious. And so by honing our clinical strategy to focus on a 12-minute walk test rather than maybe the more traditional 6-minute walk test, we really felt that we were capturing that spectrum of the disease. You know, the first 6 minutes is often driven by phosphocreatinine metabolism, glycolysis, and really when we looked at the genetic fingerprint of mitochondrial diseases, the oxidative phosphorylation was really what's going wrong in this patient population. And that usually starts to kick in 4 to 5 minutes into a walk test. So we felt maybe going with a 12-minute walk test might better capture the disease. We were agnostic initially as to what the right indication would be. We simply felt that that was the right approach. In addition to that, we strongly felt, having talked to the patient populations and doctors like yourself, that capturing fatigue and pain and energy and fatigue in patient-reported outcomes that were readily available, that had been used for prior FDA approvals, that were translated into multiple languages, and had a good benchmark for what was clinically significant would be important. And so over the last 18 months, working with the folks initially in the UK, we were able to enroll and complete our study. I think Alex described that earlier. And the results from that were sufficiently promising in terms of the walk test, the PROs, some of the more esoteric exercise testing that people do, like VO2 max and sub-maximal exercise testing. That allowed us to really home our program and move forward. So I think it's difficult when clinical trials fail, but the key thing is you often learn more from those failures than you do from successes. So actually understanding what went wrong there, and I must confess, I must share with everyone that all the companies involved historically, Stealth, Reata, have been really good at sharing information confidentially with us about what their learning experiences were. And that's been really, really helpful in us thinking through our clinical program.
So you bring up very good points, because what you're saying is you kind of got inspired by other clinical trials, and what you saw is that really the most bothersome symptom in our patient population, especially for the adults, are the fatigue and the myopathy, and so that's where you went with. But in terms of selecting your endpoint, you were a little bit more creative, because you really took into consideration how your drug worked, and you tried to adjust that outcome measure to really tailor it to the mechanism of action of your drug, which is really something important that we have been talking about earlier today. How do you really target that specific mechanism of action of this drug? So Tolga, you also have a upcoming trial in primary mitochondrial myopathy with a very similar drug. How was your approach trying to learn from prior experiences? Can you tell us a little bit?
Sure. It is, of course, it's the common challenge we are all facing, as discussed earlier, how to evaluate outcome. This is why we have, from the beginning of our program, with academic centers and organizations like in order to bring what is important, but based on feedback to optimize the endpoints. And we are participating and supporting some pilot studies to further evaluate fatigue scales, as well as the other biomarkers, like what is more relevant to our compound to assess.
Tolga, I'm just going to ask you to speak up a little bit, because your connection
Sure.
is not really good and we're having a hard time hearing you. Is that
okay? I will speak louder. Thank you. Thank you, Amel. So we are participating also some pilot studies, and as well as the biomarker and the natural history studies in certain academic centers with experiences with this patient population, in order to define, based on patients' feedback and the experience with the outcome measures existing in the field. We are also investing on evaluating the video assessments, which and the audio interviews, which can be done in patients' home setting to decrease the burden of the patients coming to the studies, and like functional motor tests being impacted by this burden. And also we are introducing some objective assessment in some sites during our study, cardiac and skeletal muscle imaging. So collectively to bring a better understanding and to evaluate our compound. I think one thing is different that we are planning. It has been also discussed earlier, the duration of the study. Of course, based on mechanism of action, we can hypothesize the duration, or we can modify, but this has been discussed at the FDA workshop last year. This was also emphasized over and over every time we interact with the guys and patients, whether the duration of 3 months or 6 months will be efficient. We'll be continuously collecting the outcome, but this is why we set our trial duration to weeks, and to properly evaluate and this population.
Thank you. So you really took it to heart to really apply all the recommendation that you probably heard about at the FDA meeting. So I commend you for that. It's really important to really do your homework before you start. And I think that's a big lesson that we've learned. It's one thing to be very excited within the community, and we're hearing our patient really pushing us towards these clinical trials, but it's also very important to be diligent and really gather all the information before any trial can start. So Magnus, you are somewhere in between, not technically a PMM trial, but sort of. Tell us about your thinking process internally as to why you're selecting the indication that you have selected, and what was your process like?
Yeah, thank you, Amel. Yeah, so I think we can say that we probably wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the trials that the community already have been doing. And I think there are some important lessons and a lot of things that were done right, but also some improvements. So I think two key things that have been mentioned today, but have really been important in the way we have approached it is one, how to optimally select the patient population. So we have not been that fond of the term or definition primary mitochondrial myopathy, but still, I mean, myopathy, we see it as one of several important outcome measures, and certainly muscle weakness was lifted up as one of the most important disease expressions that the patients want us to focus on. So certainly that is part of it, but we have chosen a different angle to defining the patient population. And in doing that, I mean, you mentioned linked to the mechanism of action. So we have looked at what data do we have from our own preclinical and experimental work. I mean, what is the phenotype and genotype of those models? But also what is known about our target. So from cell studies and animal studies, we know that mutations such as the 3243A2G mutation, there's NADH, NAD plus disbalance has been described, and we have seen it in our own experiments. And also there are a lot of biomarkers linked to the redox status. And since that is our target, and biomarkers have several uses, we think one part of biomarkers is also to help us refine the patient population. So there are some biomarkers emerging. None of them is really validated to follow patient response, but they are gaining attraction for diagnosis. And what is intriguing for us is that, I mean, the traditional biomarkers, such as lactate pyruvate, it's really reflecting the NADH, NAD plus status, but also the emerging biomarkers such as GDF15 and FGF21. So we think that's important also in the patient selection criteria. And generally, I mean, we haven't got the full regulatory feedback, so we are in that process now. So we can't tell too many details of the plans because it's not set in stone yet. But we are looking to target more the spectrum of disorders such as the MELAS mid spectrum of disorders and CPO KSS spectrum, knowing that a lot of patients fall somewhere between those classically defined syndromes. So that has been our take on when it comes to patient selection.
Thank you, Magnus. Phil, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was just going to say, you know, I think it's important, you know, I'm somewhat of a proxy for the patient community here, right, about lessons learned and how we're going to do things differently going forward. You know, there's an education that needs to take place of the mitochondrial disease patient community that we may have to do things differently in clinical trials going forward than we have in the past. That might mean longer trials. It may be staying on intervention, you know, longer. But if it gives us a better chance of success, that's the take-home message that, you know, we have to be able to adapt. I mean, first and foremost, we need the patient community to stay engaged and interested in participating in clinical research, but also understand we're all learning together, the clinicians, the industry stakeholders, and the patient community right at the same time.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that's very important. So just going back to Niall and to all of you, one thing that we hear a lot from our patient is the selection of the patient population that has been enrolled in the trial so far. And nothing to, I'm not trying to minimize the amount of fatigue or physical exertion that the patients suffer from, but we hear a lot from our patients, especially parents of our pediatric patient. When is it going to be time for a pediatric trial? Why are they not focusing on trials that deal with acute decompensations and severe complications? So can you tell us a little bit how you ended up choosing the population that you chose, and are there any plans for extending those indications? Niall?
Sure, absolutely. Initially, drug development, drug discovery is a little bit more of a pragmatic, what the art of the possible. And when you talk to regulators, they often will often expect to see signs of safety and efficacy in adults before they'll move into a potentially more vulnerable patient population, pediatrics and adolescents. And so it's the regulatory environment that we're in. One needs to be fairly safe, fairly confident that there's an expectation of safety and efficacy in a patient population, a younger patient population, who often metabolize and handle and respond to drugs and the pharmacology of drugs a little bit differently from adults. So it's always a learning process, and we like to go stepwise, ensure in adults the drug is safe and well tolerated before we would expose children who have, growth ongoing, different developmental stages that can be difficult to probe out. So one of the main things we like to do is expose our drug to younger animals initially. These are called juvenile toxicity studies. And most regulators will require those before one is able to go into a pediatric population in combination with the evidence that the drug is safe and well tolerated, with a preponderance of efficacy data before one is allowed by regulations to go into pediatric and adolescent patient population. So initially the first port of call is the adults, and then we move earlier. Yes, in Reneo's plans, as we move forward, we are very keen and interested in testing our drug in adolescents and pediatrics, but it's going to be a stepwise, very safety focused type approach, because those are very vulnerable patients, and we want to make sure we do it right and not do any harm.
Thank you, Niall. And Tolga, you have already some plans for enrolling pediatric patients in your trial. Can you tell us what your internal thought process was and how you ended up choosing the patient population that you chose?
Yes, we have, as I mentioned during my presentation, with the same compound, also we are initiating a Duchenne muscular dystrophy study. We have done all the preclinical work that Neil was mentioning, and this is why also based on the well under treated and where the one of the biggest needs are, already thinking to expand the age window at the also trying the encouragement and feedback from it. Also, we lowered the age group to 8 in our study in the pediatric portion. So it will be staggered, starting first with adult and then adding the second cohort of from 8 to 18 cohort into our phase 2 study. We would like to, along with the PMD assessment, we would like to also assess younger age population for PMM indication.
Thank you, Tolga. Magnus, how about you?
I think we have a pretty similar approach as Reneo. We're thinking of a stepwise approach, but then I would also like to mention, I mean, a lot of it is related to that. We want to show safety first in adults if we can, but it also depends a lot on the drug and how it has been developed and the mechanism of action. So For instance, our second up project, MV354, that project is developed specifically for Lee syndrome. So there we are planning to go directly into the pediatric population. But that's earlier. It's still in the GLP and tox phase. So we hope to do clinical development, so phase 1 studies next year. But when it comes to KL1333, since we're interested in the CPO KSS spectrum, Pearson syndrome is quite closely related to that. So that would be a natural stepwise approach to do a study in Pearson syndrome.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil, do we have any questions from the chat?
Not yet. So maybe I'll just take the opportunity to remind everyone that please do submit your questions. They'll be passed along to me, and we'll try to get them in front of the panel here, do the best we can to address those.
Thank you, Phil.
Yeah.
So to all of you now, having gone through this process and being already advanced in your planning, what did our community do well, and what should we improve on? What structures have you found helpful? What can we do better to help serve you, develop these trials and implement these trials in the future? Niall?
Sure. Thanks very much, Amel. Patient advocacy groups and groups that help us learn about the disease, introduce us to the patients, introduce us to the KOLs. We couldn't do what we do. We wouldn't have even got to the start line without the interactions with the UMDF and the Lilly Foundation in the United Kingdom, Mito Canada, and the Mito Group in Australia. It's an avenue into understanding what's important to the patients, how we can help them, what's the most bothersome symptoms, as you alluded to, and really what's going wrong in their day-to-day lives that we can try and help. And that's been extremely useful. We always like more when we develop drugs, and I think as Tolga alluded to, natural history and registries are extremely important. A lot of the initial studies one will do in a rare orphan space are often open label studies because you want to establish safety and tolerability of the drug, and enrolling patients into a double-blinded placebo control when you do not have efficacy data in hand is always quite difficult. The downside of doing an open label study, of course, is what are you comparing the results to? And that's where having propensity matched natural history, but that's a big undertaking. It's quite expensive. It's very time consuming, but if one had a magic wand to do things better, it's always to have that data set. I can't speak highly enough, not just because I've been invited on this, but I can't speak highly enough of the interactions with Phil and the team at UMDF. It's been I think back in the day, there was a regional meeting in San Diego, and PMM wasn't really on our radar. And we actually met some of the folks there. Bruce Cohen was there, Richard Haas, and really got us interested in the indication as being something of a higher medical need, something where our mechanism of action could bring benefit. And quite frankly, without that meeting, perhaps I wouldn't be on this call right now. So it's been fantastic.
Great. So advocacy groups, more reaching out, more education, and maybe targeting pharmaceutical companies that don't even know that they are interested in mitochondrial disease to bring them over and bridge that gap. That's great. Tolga, how about you? How can we be better?
Well, I mean, one of the first thing we had when we had the synapses, we sent it to Phil to have it reviewed by some of the patients, and it was extremely helpful. And this is why, I mean, this is an ongoing actual interaction starting from the Mito Bridge time and being connected to the community and being listening. And we are very adaptive, open-minded. We are looking forward to implement the new assessments, like the video assessment, for example, to coordinate patients' home setting environment, and trying to implement in our studies, and based on feedback we are receiving. This is why we reduced the number of site visits, for example, in our studies, and to collect more distant home setting information more than the site. And it is crucial. We will continue to this interaction and ask you maybe organize more forums where we can sit together with you and with patients to hear more and listen and tailored our studies accordingly, because as it was mentioned earlier before, there is no validated, approved endpoint here. We have to create this together, and the more successful we are, and more beneficial it to the community. And we have to do this together.
Yeah.
As a whole village, as you said.
So more natural history studies, more collaboration, more discussions with advocacy groups and patient feedback. And how about you, Magnus?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the other speakers here, and I must say it's a really fun community to work with, because there is so much positive engagement from you experts, treating physicians, and the patient advocacy groups, and the different companies involved in developing. So it is very rewarding to work in this environment. And what would be really good, and it's related to natural history, is to have some standard assessment tools being further developed. And now when you are getting this experience with working with companies and being with the meetings with the regulators, to learn also, I mean, what is regulatory viable? I mean, if we have these different PROs, which one are the regulators more comfortable with? So to build that, so standard clinical outcome assessment tools for different disease expressions, because now we're focusing on myopathy, but how about all the other disease expressions? Because that will be very valuable when we go back and look and maybe do retrospective natural history, but also common disease staging tools. So we can easily assess, this is suitable. How many patients do you have at your center that are suitable, and compare it and see how it develops over time. So Frank Sasinovsky spoke earlier today to see, are there differences that can explain different outcome and different progression rates? So that are two parts of my wish list.
Perfect, thank you. And I think, Phil, you have a comment?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to go back to what you said a few minutes ago about, you know, maybe there's companies out there that don't even know they should be working in mitochondrial disease. I think this is very much a model, you know, in other disease communities. We tried to benchmark mitochondrial disease with other disease communities like juvenile diabetes. And you can imagine, right, there's a lot of work going on around metabolism, but maybe nobody's thinking directly about, you know, that particular form of diabetes. I think the opportunity we have is around mitochondrial function and dysfunction. And we know that mitochondrial function and dysfunction are central concepts around human health in general, and many much larger disease indications like diabetes and neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And there's lots of research going on in those areas, with lots of assets and drug candidates being moved forward that may have applicability to the rare inherited forms of mitochondrial disease. So I think, you know, I take that as a personal challenge. And I think for all of us involved in this too, we have to look for ways to build those bridges out to these other disease communities to, you know, fill the top of the funnel, so to speak, because this is very much a game of you need as many options as possible moving through the drug development process, because it is so difficult.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. So just as an investigator, I'm seeing the landscape change so quickly and so much. When I first started in mitochondrial medicine, there was like only one company interested in doing trials. And now look at you, all of you here are really ready to go and targeting very similar patient populations. So when I think about that, I'm thinking, we don't have an unlimited number of patients. So how, when you all start going live and we need to enroll in all of your trials, how do we as a community really try to prioritize our enrollment in your trials? And that's a great problem to have. I'm not saying that that's a problem, but from your perspective, knowing that there is going to be more competition, do you have a contingency plan on extending your trial period, or are there any more innovative approaches that you are thinking about to try to recruit for your trials? Niall?
Sure. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's actually a quality problem to have, to go from one to multiple studies, but then patients become difficult to enroll. I think one of the key things is geographical spread. You know, this is a US focus, but, you know, I'm sure in common with the folks at Astellas, the idea is to do a worldwide study and look for patient populations who maybe don't often get called upon for clinical studies. That's one of our key focuses. In an ideal world, it would be fantastic for all the companies to be able to collaborate and have shared placebo arms and seamless protocols, a standard protocol that everyone uses. But the reality is drugs are different, timelines are different, emphasis, the endpoints we're going to use are different. So it's going to become complicated. And all I can ask from the patient population and from you, Amel, and all the doctors is patience. You will get pulled in multiple directions, and your resources and time will be used up. But the good news is we're all trying to get in the same direction, which is develop drugs for these patient population. But it's going to be difficult. I understand that.
Thank you, Tolga.
Well, I mean, there will be always, I think, competition in any given development, drug development field, and that is, I think, very natural. And as you mentioned, also, it is actually good from the patients that there will be more opportunities to do something more efficacious. But on the other hand, there might be issues with recruitment timelines and enrollment, and so I think our job is, given opportunity like this one, for me to convey and to our message, to what we are doing different than the previous studies, what innovative ideas and opportunities we are bringing this study, and also again emphasizing the commitment of Astellas at global level. As I mentioned, currently we are about to start, when it started already, 3 part Delta program in the patients and globally. So we have sources to conduct these studies, and we are expecting that our commitment and sources will help us, but there will be competition, that's true.
Thank you, Tolga. And Magnus, you have a few seconds to take the last word.
Yeah, I mean, recruitment can of course be challenging. I think there will be some differences in inclusion and exclusion. And overall, I think it's benefit that a lot of companies are interested in, and a lot of the positive development we've seen is just thanks to a lot of companies having that interest and the great work you've been doing, both from the academia hospital side and from the patient advocacy group side, of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it back to Phil.
Yes, thank you all. And I think we're going to try to build off of these comments in this discussion now by just sharing a brief video that summarizes some early efforts taking place within the UMDF with many stakeholder partners to establish a clinical trial network. So one of the messages we hear from these sponsors and others is that it's challenging, right, to find the right people, to find the right patients. And our hope is that there's a stewardship role that UMDF can play, and that we need partners to do that. And so Dr. Karaa is going to give us a brief summary around a new project that we're calling Treat Mito.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm very honored and excited to be telling you about this new opportunity that we have been working on. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what the mitochondrial disease community has been doing over the years. These discussions about how complex primary mitochondrial disorders are and how challenging it is to develop and conduct clinical trials for primary mitochondrial disease has been an ongoing issue that has been rehashed within the community over the years, and for which some solutions have already been developed. So in order to understand what we need for the future, we need to understand what we have available now. We have several stakeholders within the community that have been striving over the years to improve the diagnosis, the management, the clinical care of our patient with primary mitochondrial disease, and we all ultimately had in mind that hope and that promise of a cure for the future. Of course, all we do, and at the center of all of this, are our patients and their families. We have patients that are all over the United States that are suffering with this disease, and they are our inspiration of why we do what we do every day. Those patients over the years have been cared for by several specialists, some knowledgeable about mitochondrial disease and some are not. And so it became clear a few years ago that these patients needed to have a home, a clinical home with clinicians within multidisciplinary clinics that knew and had expertise about primary mitochondrial disease. And so in 2018, the Mitochondrial Care Network was developed, certifying clinicians and clinical site as mitochondrial medicine centers where a patient could go and can receive a multidisciplinary coordinated care for their primary mitochondrial disorders. So we're happy to have about 21 of these sites across the US. And the hope is that these patients would come in and would obtain the optimized clinical management and care that they deserve, but also a way for us clinicians to really keep track of where these patients are, how many we have, to very quickly mobilize them in case a clinical trial becomes available, and also to keep them aware of what the opportunities are out there, whether it's clinical or translational research. The community also has tremendous advocacy. We have several advocacy groups that are listed here. Of course, the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation have been leading the way for many years now and has been instrumental in funding a lot of basic and clinical research over the years that has really pushed the path forward and pushed the research forward for our primary mitochondrial disease patient. More recently, the UMDF has been involved in the finding a cure for Lee syndrome and bringing together international experts to try to come up with solution as to how to design clinical trials and optimize clinical trials for Lee syndrome. The United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation also has a patient registry that captures data from patients that is put themselves into the registry. And so these advocacy groups have been really instrumental in the mitochondrial community. We also have professional societies that have been efforts that have been led by physicians and scientists interested and involved in mitochondrial medicine. The Mitochondrial Medicine Society is one of them. This was developed about 20 years ago and puts forth clinical guidelines for primary mitochondrial disease diagnostics and management. And the idea is we are really trying to harmonize and unify the care that our patients receive across the United States. The Mitochondrial Research and Medicine Society has done the same for the basic science, the biology of mitochondrial medicine, and has put mitochondria on the map internationally over the years. We also have research consortia that are federally funded. The North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium, led by Dr. Michio Hirano, has been instrumental over the last 9 years to put together a physician-curated registry and biorepository for patients with primary mitochondrial disease or patients who are suspected of having a primary mitochondrial disease. The consortium has about 19 sites of researchers and clinicians that are working together to try to better understand the disease and come up with outcome measures and design a clinical trial for patients with PMD. MCDR, led by Dr. Marnie Falk at CHOP, has also tried to do the same from the molecular perspective and the genomic perspective, developing this huge resource where we can, in one place, find all the information available about a certain gene or a certain mutation that can lead to mitochondrial disease. You will hear a lot more about the MCN, MCDR, and NEMDEC later today, with specific updates on their efforts. We also have a lot of researchers that are involved in the US with mitochondrial medicine and mitochondria in general. we have basic translational and clinical researchers. We have collaboration nationally and internationally. We also have our industry partners, and we have more and more of them over the years. Pharmaceutical companies that are interested in engaging with the community to try to see whether their products could be amenable to a trial in primary mitochondrial diseases. Companies that already have a product that they think is very valuable and are trying to pursue clinical trials, companies that already do clinical trial, and also diagnostic laboratories that provide genetic testing and other biochemical testing for the diagnosis of mitochondrial disorders. And then we have legislators, federal government, with whom we interact very routinely in terms of introducing new legislation for diagnostic, therapeutic, or rare disease in general, and improving funding for mitochondrial disease research, as well as accelerating pathways of drug approval, like you've heard this morning from the workshop done at the FDA. So all of these entities and stakeholders have been working together over the years and have done really a good job at communicating and collaborating. The problem is, however, that these collaborations and interactions have so far been very siloed. You have the clinicians collaborating with the advocacy group, the patient, the professional society, industry, research, and you have arrows going all over the place with every entity trying to collaborate and not duplicate efforts with other entities. This makes it a huge challenge because unless you are part of all of these entities at once, the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, and that creates a lot of delays and a lot of duplicate efforts in trying to reach that goal of finding a cure for our mitochondrial disease patient. So the solution that we want to come up with is, how do we unify these stakeholders and all of these efforts into a unified approach or a one silo that takes into consideration all the needs of all of these stakeholders and try to come up with a unified solution to all the problems that we talked about today. And we think that one of those solutions is to create an entity called the Translational Research Advancing Therapy for Mitochondrial Disease. This is a Treat Mito consortium that was developed to specifically address the clinical trial needs for our community. In order to develop this entity, we have looked at colleagues and other rare disorders and non-rare disorders that have gone through this. This is not something unique to primary mitochondrial disease or a new dilemma that we are facing alone. A lot of other disorders, common and rare, have gone through the same process of trying to unify, organize, and accelerate the therapeutic efforts to try to come up with a treatment for their own disorders. So instead of reinventing the wheel, we wanted to learn from all of those efforts and see the good and the bad, what has worked, what hasn't worked. And so over the past few years, I have been really surveying the landscape to see what has been done before. And if for doing so, I reached out to industry partners, partners that we had already engaged with to do clinical trials, partners that were interested in conducting clinical trials in mitochondrial disease, patient advocacy groups that have been at the forefront and listening to the patients and what the patient needs are, FDA consultants and FDA regulators, principal investigators that are doing basic science, translational science, and clinical research, and other clinical trial consortia, whether they were for disorders like cancer, which has led this effort many, many years ago and has been very successful in streamlining the treatment for cancer and clinical trial for cancer, or whether it's for other rare diseases such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. I have had conversation with several of these people to see how they develop their clinical trial consortia and what has worked and hasn't worked for them. So after distilling all the information from all of these discussions, in partnership with the UMDF and other clinicians such as Dr. Hirano, Dr. Cohn, Dr. Haas, we have met repeatedly to try to flesh out what Treat Mito would look like and what its mission would be. And this is what we would like preliminarily to present to you today, which is very exciting for us, is that we think that Treat Mito is a much needed new entity that is going to bring all the mitochondrial disease community stakeholders together. And the mission as we see it, and this will develop over time, is to really develop, organize, and oversee the unified pipeline for drug development in mitochondrial disorders. We would like to really be able to evaluate and support early drug development and translational efforts for primary mitochondrial diseases and mitochondrial diseases in general. We would like to develop patient-centered outcome measures for therapeutic studies in children and adults with mitochondrial disease, and facilitate and eventually conduct multi-site clinical trials to streamline drug development. We also want this ultimate effort to try to improve medical care and health outcomes for our patients with mitochondrial disease. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, we need to self-organize much more and much better than what we are doing currently. We need, as you have heard throughout the day today, well-defined outcome measures. These are extremely important for us to be able to conduct successful clinical trials. How do we get to outcome measures that are well-validated and well-established for primary mitochondrial disease? Well, we need a lot of data. Data. We need patient, we need to validate these outcomes, and we need to come up with outcomes that are meaningful to our patients. How do we do that? We need academic sites with specialists in the disease to work together. We already started doing that by developing these mitochondrial care network and by developing the North American Mitochondrial Disease Consortium. Now we have to have them interface and talk to each other from the clinical and the research perspective. We need available and willing patients that are educated about clinical trial research so that they get engaged in being part of these clinical trials. It's not enough to develop a trial and have them available. We need to enroll these trials. And how do we do that? We need to have engaged patients that see the value into enrolling in these clinical trials. And the only way we can achieve that is really to educate our patients. We need a unified collection of biological specimen to do more research, to be able to come up with those biomarkers and outcomes and all of that, something that we have started doing with NAMDEG, MCDR, and the MCN and the UMDF registry as well. So what's going on right now is that we are doing bits and pieces of all of this, but these efforts have been really scattered. So rather than attacking all of these issues bit by bit or disease by disease or center by center, we need really to work together at attacking this disease, not by a single company, not by a single academic investigator or center, but really by unifying all of these players into a platform with entities that create a network where we can share all of this data, interface, and communicate, and where that left hand really knows what the right hand is doing. So our short-term goals include the development of an expert governance board that will oversee the approaches that we are going to take. This is kind of similar to the scientific advisory board that will initially lay down the developments out there and try to engage with industry, engage with the regulatory entities, and try to come up with a priority list of things that we need to do. Second, we need to formally evaluate and analyze the mitochondrial disease landscape in the US. We need to better understand our patients and their families and caregivers' perspective about clinical trials in general, what is meaningful to them in terms of outcome measures that they would be that they would agree upon and that would seem appropriate to them. We need to survey what the needs of our pharmaceutical and industry partners are, because what works for them as private companies and what their endpoints are really different from ours in academia and those of advocacy groups. So we need to work together to try to better understand what our needs are. And we also need to have an inventory of available scientific and clinical resources within the community, so that if we need to develop that outcome measure or come up with that biomarker, we need to know who the players are that we can tap into to help expedite this process. The long term of Treat Mito is also to develop a centralized collaborative infrastructure with a unified information platform that would allow the creation of a data-driven path forward in drug development for primary mitochondrial disease and mitochondrial diseases in general. This is going to be helpful to inform design support and eventually manage innovative observational and interventional trials for mitochondrial disease. Some of this is already ongoing, but as I said, it's ongoing into silos and using different platforms that don't always interact or communicate with each other. So what the goal here is really to try to interface with each other in a much more efficient way, to try to share that information and try to find the gaps very quickly and fill them more appropriately, as opposed to restarting every effort and duplicating these efforts. What our vision really is for this Treat Mito consortium to really help support the community in a much more comprehensive way, and to not restart anything fresh or recreate the wheels, as we say, but really try to leverage the community resources that are available now, build upon them, improve the interface between these silos to try to really expedite this process, and to really help our industry partners find a home where, instead of going from one investigator or one academic center at a time to try to gather information and develop these advisory board meetings, to have a one-stop shop where they can come in and tell us what their needs are, and we can help them engage the whole community from beginning to end to try to help them designing their clinical trial, help them select the patient population needed to enhance the possibilities of reaching their endpoints, try to help them come up with the best outcome measure available, and if that's not available, trying to work together to develop those outcome measure while tapping into the resources within the community that we already have. Ultimately, we would like to have access to all the resources from these clinical trial once they are done, whether the drug gets FDA approval or the drug fails. We want all that information that we gather from those trials to be housed in this consortium so that we can learn from it and we can use it to further our understanding of the disease and how clinical trials are conducted. Ultimately, what this is going to achieve is that we will be refining the disease phenotype, improving our natural histories intake, improving our biomarker development and discovery. We will strive to tailor our outcome measures to the clinical trial at hand and the product at hand, individualized clinical trial designs for our patient population, the drug, the target's effect, and have more streamlined regulatory discussions to help improve the timelines for these clinical trials. We're hoping that all of that is going to accelerate FDA approval and help our patient and our community achieve that cure much faster. And with that, I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.